You picked a safe major. Maybe it was engineering, finance, or pre-med. Something practical. It probably felt right at the time. Your parents loved it, your friends were doing it, and all the guides online said you'd be able to land that prestigious job when you graduated. But now you're wondering, why doesn't it really feel right anymore? If you're struggling with why your major feels wrong, we're going to cover how to reframe that situation. It isn't a crisis. It's a sign that you need to think a little bit more deeply about what it is you want out of your career. First, let's get this out of the way. The most common reason there's a disconnect with your major. It's because most people pick their major with a lot of emotion, but without a lot of thought. And it may not seem like it's emotion at the time, but you may not be operating out of a real place of logic. Sometimes those under the surface emotions are based on pressure or prestige or fear. The problem with those emotions is basically that they're primal. They can shortcut your logical thinking faculties with ease. To give you an example, let's say I'm trying to sell you a car. What are some of the ways you could position the product? Well, first, I could say, I can't guarantee the price tomorrow. And so what that is basically I'm saying buy now or forever hold your peace. So that's pressure. Next, what about prestige? I could say, our last car was bought by a famous ball player, and so you might start to rethink your initial decision to not buy. Because, hey, if they're doing it and it's good enough for them, it might be good enough for me, even if it doesn't really meet any of my criteria. And then finally, fear. I could say, you care about your family, don't you? Our car is the top-rated vehicle in safety tests. So what's interesting about that statement is that it seems logical, but not from your perspective. Basically what's happening is I lead with an emotion and then I defend that emotion with logic. The emotion is you care about your family, don't you? AKA fear for their safety. And then I defend that emotional point with logic by saying maybe this car is the top rated in safety tests. So sometimes you'll see these things where it seems like it's logical, but it's actually not. It's actually a defense of an emotional point. Each of those factors, if you think about it, are liable to turn your brain off involuntarily. And so in your situation, if you picked a major, maybe you picked your major based on pressure. Hey, you need to pick your major before you graduate 11th grade, or before you do this, or before you do that. I mean, technically, it's probably better to pick your major earlier than later, but there really isn't a time limit in that sense. So there's a pressure element in that situation. Now about prestige, maybe you have no desire to go to certain really fancy or expensive schools, but because you know that, hey, if you get into that school, you'll always be able to say, hey, I went to this school or I went to that school. But once again, it's emotion that's leading the thought process. And then finally, fear. Oh, you don't want to be stuck with not making enough money, do you? Once again, that may be a real risk, but you can't necessarily make a decision just based on that, right? So each of those factors, like I mentioned, can quickly overturn any logical criteria you have very quickly. If you can really be honest with yourself, those three factors and probably many more are very common in how people pick their majors. And so it's very likely that your major doesn't fit because you gave more weight to artificial or external emotions instead of your own passions, interests, and strengths. So now you may have felt all three or a few of these in your degree selection process as well. And like I said, it's not uncommon, but you owe it to yourself to think through if it still fits. Here's a real example of someone who overcame some of these traps. If you've been alive the last 10 years or 15 years on the planet, then you've heard of and probably utilized Instagram. It was acquired for $1 billion and made Kevin Systrom a wealthy individual basically overnight. So what kind of person do you think Kevin is? If we think from a probability perspective, he's probably a classic tech bro, right? Computer science undergrad, maybe a dropout, started a company at some incubator. Well, if that's your guess, you'd actually be wrong. He studied management science in undergrad. To make it a little bit more interesting, he wasn't in love with it. So on the side, he started exploring photography and technology. And so he had actually dabbled in coding when he was younger. Now, what's strange is he was so interested in photography that he actually took an entire year off from school and went to live in Florence to hone his photography skills. So that's pretty extreme, but Florence is a pretty picturesque place. He worked at Google for a bit, didn't get the promotion he wanted to product manager, and essentially this idea about photography, tech, and their intersection kept bothering him. And then eventually he pitched a few famous VCs on his idea, quit his job, and then he built Instagram along with his co-founder. But his degree was management science. That's probably the last degree you would have guessed for him to have. But here's the thing, it didn't completely define him. He didn't feel connected to the degree, and he correctly didn't pursue where that degree could take him. But he also didn't wholesale throw it out the window. He found a way to reframe it and combine it with other interests. So here's the thing. Kevin may have picked the wrong degree when he started out, but in a sense, he was able to recover because of that reframing. And that's what you need to keep in mind as well. So how do you tell if you're misaligned? Well, you might be misaligned if you're good at the work that you're doing or the subject matter that you're learning, but you're bored by it. Maybe you aced bio AP, but you would never want to deal with medical environments. And I don't blame you. A second reason you might be misaligned, or a second sign you might be misaligned, is you can't see yourself doing it long term. You might see it as a stepping stone. I personally did this with engineering. I didn't want to be stuck behind a desk designing a bracket for a year, right? Now, third, you feel like you're optimizing for someone else's goals. Did a parent want you to follow this path, or did some of your friends go down this path and you followed them even though you weren't really passionate about it? So if any of this rings true, you shouldn't freak out. It's actually data, and it might be a sign that you need to be thinking a little bit more deeply about how to reframe and figure out what you align with. So there are 3 more questions you should ask yourself if you're in this situation. So first, do you have an intrinsic passion for the field? Basically, if you're in economics, do you have a love for economics? Or maybe do you have a love for designing mechanical systems? Is there an underlying emotion that gets stirred when you think about this field? Second question, do I care about the problems that this field solves? Do you think the field actually solves problems? Do the problems feel real to you? And are they important to you? And then third, would I respect who I'd become on this path? So next, think about the people you've met or follow who are 10, 20, or even 30 years down this path. Do you see them as role models? Would you be okay becoming those people or living that life? Okay, by now you should have a really good idea if you should stay in this field or not. Now, what do you do after that? Well, let's talk about prioritizing small shifts versus big leaps. You don't have to switch majors tomorrow, but you do need to explore. Side projects, electives, internships, anything that gives you more data is a good thing. Think of it like an experiment. Your hypothesis was that this major would be a good fit for you, and as time has gone on, you've collected data that shows that maybe this isn't the case. So what do you do in the scientific method? So go try out something new, give it a shot, and then observe, and then repeat. The other thing you need to think about is differentiation. When you're trying out things, even outside of school, that you authentically like, even if it's sort of out there. Think Kevin Systrom taking a year off doing photography in Italy. Well, when you do that, you're actually adding another ingredient to the pot. In effect, your authentic actions begin to create a life that's more of a true representation of who you are. And in the end, that's where your passions, your strengths, and your business sense intersect. The clarity that you want comes from testing, not theorizing. Okay, so what's next? First off, you need to reframe the way you're looking at your major. It may not have been the optimal degree, but you learned something that made you unique. When I used to work in consulting, I usually saw people freaking out about the minutia of the job, Like, wow, I need to optimize for this small raise, which usually wasn't as high as you wanted, or this random perk that the firm gives you, so you could buy a pair of tennis shoes, or this random frequent flyer mileage goal. They were very busy trying to maximize the value they could get out of the job every year. But they were very myopic. They were focusing on the smallest things. And so that never made sense to me. To me, the job was an opportunity to learn. Not every project was useful, but I learned something from every single one. The experience of working with executives, understanding how they thought while leading massive companies in sectors I was interested in, well, that was the opportunity of a lifetime. So as they say, you do need to keep the main thing the main thing. So that sort of highlights the way you should be thinking about your degree too. Maybe you didn't get into an Ivy League school, or you didn't get into the most competitive or prestigious major, but that actually doesn't matter. Your degree doesn't limit your potential. It's a launch pad to begin your career, and it's what makes you unique. And most importantly, it's given you some starting points to potentially realign. So here are a few tips on how to realign to something that may fit you better. Try this out. So first, if you're in school, audit classes for ones you actually enjoy. Pretty much most schools allow you to audit a class. You're not graded, but you'll get to sit in on class sessions. Basically, you find a class, you just sit in, you expose yourself to new stimuli, and you see if anything resonates. And you're not committing to anything, you're just testing things out. Next, talk to 3 people at least 5 years ahead of you in your field. And I would tap into alumni networks, even if you're out of school. Alumni networks are one of the most underutilized benefits of going to an undergrad institution. And then finally, write a vision of your work life at 30 years old. Plan it out. See what it would look like. Envision it, imagine it, and then ask yourself, do you actually believe that what you wrote is realistic, or it's something you would like to do? So if you take these 3 actions, you'll have even more data on where to go next. Once again, that action or that testing is what creates the clarity. All right, back to the beginning. Questioning your major is natural, and honestly, it's the sign of an honest intellect. Alignment is important, but realize as you build your career, you're in a constant cycle of moving and measuring and moving and measuring. And so as you take more steps in any direction, you'll know if you're getting further or closer to where you need to be.